Thanks everyone for coming along. And thanks especially to our speaker for today, who is Professor Vedi Hadiz. Vedi is Director and Professor of Asian Studies at the Asia Institute at the University of Melbourne, where he is also Vice Chancellor International, which I believe occupies an awful lot of his time these days. So I hope you'll enjoy talking about research for the next hour. Vedi has had a stellar career amongst his accolades. He's been in Australia. He's been an ARC Future Fellow from 2010 to 2014. Vedi's research interests are focused on political sociology and political economy issues, especially those regarding development in Indonesia and more broadly Southeast Asia, which to at least some extent links to his presentation today, which is going to be on Islam and the left in Indonesia and Turkey. So, Vedi, if you're ready to start your presentation, the floor is yours.
Okay, thank you, Duncan. So, just a bit of background. This is something that I and a couple of colleagues in Turkey started in 2018. It's a project that requires quite a bit of field work, but it's been scuppered by COVID. But still, you know, we've tried to soldier on, and so basically, the study is about the transformation of social basis of support for leftist politics in Indonesia and Turkey, and how they've been transformed into social bases of Islamist politics over the last few decades. And of course, Turkey and Indonesia are the big, Muslim majority countries. But we see that there are different pathways here. In Turkey, the AKP has taken state power. But in Indonesia, Islamic forces are nowhere near taking over state power, and therefore, there are different pathways here. But the result is that even though you have these different pathways, you can't really say that either case Islamic politics has achieved hegemony, as I'll try to explain further. So one pathway is Islamic forces dominating or taking control of the state, but still failing to establish hegemony. And one pathway is where the Islamic forces fail to dominate the state, but actually the lexicon of Islamic politics gets increasingly mainstreamed in political contestation, and that also needs to be explained, how that happens without a political victory of Islamic forces. So that's why we compared these two countries. Now, a few things that also appealed to us in terms of comparing these two countries was that we felt that two things: the social transformations of the bases of leftist politics into Islamist politics. Actually, for myself, who is an Indonesian, and for my Turkish colleagues who of course are Turkish, can be seen also in just changes in the social and also physical landscapes of the places that we're talking about. And so that was, an interesting kind of beginnings in terms of why we started to look at these things. I mean, for myself, for example, I'll be talking about the areas that we did fieldwork in Indonesia and Turkey, but just out of personal experience, we went to places in Indonesia when I was, a teenager in my 20s, where there were no sort of physical or even social attributes of Islamism, being overtly displayed. But now, if you visit, 30 years later, 40 years later, you have all of these things that you would associate with cultural Islamization. The second thing that caught us was that caught our attention was that we thought that this process of transformation of the bases of politics had to do with, in both cases, with the outcomes of Cold War era social conflicts. So clearly, I mean, some of you will know that in 65, 66, the Indonesian Communist Party was demolished in Indonesia by the military, and it used to be the third largest communist party in the world, and it is now still outlawed. Whereas in Turkey, even though you never had a strong communist party, what you did have in the 60s and especially in the 70s was strong leftist trade unions. The trade union movement had emerged as a kind of counterweight to the Kemalist establishment, and had become a sort of source of displeasure, of the military apparatus there. And in 1980, when there was a military coup in Turkey, one of the things that they did was to demolish the leftist trade unions in Turkey. So the timing of this, we thought, was also important in that in Indonesia, 65, 66 happened just before the onset of rapid capitalist industrialization, which occurred under the auspices of the regime that took over after 65, 66, the authoritarian new order of Suharto. So it was under Suharto that capitalist development emerged, all the associated developments of classes and social transformations occurring there, but in the absence of left, right? So there was no leftist counterweight to the kinds of socio-economic and political changes that were occurring in Indonesia at the time. In Turkey, of course, under Kemalism, there was a state-led capitalist development project that was very significant, from all the way back to the 30s, and there were different phases in the 50s and 60s. But from the 1980s, really, this greater incorporation into the processes of economic globalization, what you might call the neoliberalization of the global economy, took place. First under a technocratic government supported by the military, but increasingly, well, not increasingly, but later on, after the AKP took over in 2001, 2002, an Islamist project that was to be combined with economic neoliberalization, and in the absence of the sort of counterweights to the old Kemalist project of the 60s and 70s in the form of leftist trade unions. So that's the sort of background and the sort of aims and objectives and the sort of things that got us interested in comparing Indonesia and Turkey. Just grab a sip of water. Theoretically, we are, I say we because it's me and a couple of colleagues in Turkey, Serkan Ongel from Gaziantep University, Ahmed Beckman from Istanbul University. We were influenced or are influenced by Gramscian ideas of hegemony, in which as is well known, the idea is that the struggle of hegemony takes place not just by force but also by consent, and that that what becomes the popular conviction, so to speak, basically things that are accepted as common sense, sort of mainstreamed into the sort of social as well as individual consciousness, is a matter of struggle over hegemony. And some of the interpreters of Gramsci sort of developed an idea, and we also do that by saying that the struggles over hegemony are also reflected in concrete constellations of social power and social interests that you see in the societies that you might be looking at. So by looking at hegemonic contests in Turkey or Indonesia, the sort of what kind of ideas get mainstream, what kind of ideas are rejected, and so on. It's a way of also understanding the kinds of social interests, social forces that are arrayed in concrete contestations over power and interests. So not just things that are happening at the ideological realm, but things also happening, in the material realm, so to speak. The other thing that we borrow from Gramscian analysis is the idea that I already alluded to this, that hegemony is never fully attained, that there are always sort of corners in which things are contested, and we have, and we see this in different ways in both Turkey and Indonesia. So in Australia, I think there is often an idea that that Indonesia is either a military dictatorship, which it hasn't been, actually it's never been, or it's increasingly Islamist. Now that's not exactly true as well. And this project actually tries to tell you why. And in terms of Turkey, the power of the AKP, its ability to dominate the political arena in such a fashion in which it's even managed to take control of its old nemesis, the military, and so on, might give you the idea of there having been established a complete Islamist hegemony over there. But it seems like our fieldwork over there suggests that is not the case either. So that's the sort of theoretical guidelines that we undertook. So we did fieldwork as I mentioned, and we looked at particular localities, specific localities as case studies where the left used to be powerful in these two cases. So in Indonesia, we looked into areas in central Java and Yogyakarta, where you have the Yogyakarta aristocratic city, but also the aristocratic city of Solo, which both are the sort of center points of sort of traditional Javanese culture and the things associated with it, which includes a very syncretic idea of religion. So it is, people like Griffith and so on, talk about the religion of Java, or did talk about religion of Java in the 50s and 60s, and the idea was that in these places you had, Islam sort of combining or cross-fertilizing with Hindu Buddhist ideas and even pre-Hindu Buddhist ideas, developing into some sort of culture which in Java is called Kejawen, and which Goetz popularized as being abangan, right? Now, in Turkey, we went to a place called Kocaeli, which is not far from Istanbul. It was for a long time a major focal point for Turkish industrialization. It was a focal point of the state-led phase of industrialization. It was in the 70s a sort of a thriving area for left-wing trade unionist movements. But by the 90s, it had become more Islamic, and that could be shown in data regarding voting behavior. So the Refah party, which can be seen as, in a way, as a precursor to the AKP, started doing well in the 1990s, and currently the AKP does very well in Kocaeli. That used to be, the area where you would probably in the 60s and 70s not associate this area with Islamist politics. In Indonesia, even though, in these areas now, if you visited these areas now, as I alluded to earlier, the physical and social landscape would be quite different from 30 or 40 years ago. You'd see, pesantren, left and right pesantren are Islamic boarding schools. And some of these are Salafi pesantren, which is completely inimical to the idea of Javanese syncretism, by the way. And you see women wearing the hijab, and you see, all sorts of expressions of piety and so on. Whereas, 30, 40 years ago, when, I used to visit those places, you had none of these things. And it was a bastion of support for the Communist Party, actually, in the 1960s. And of sort of radical nationalism all the way up to the 1970s. And even now, even though you see all of these signatures of cultural Islamization, it hasn't, like in Turkey, translated necessarily politically, because the Islamic parties actually don't always do well in these places. They often lose, to the extent really that they're often thinking, why do we keep losing when when the constituency, when the population is obviously becoming more and more Islamic? And part of the reason for that, and this has to do with with the idea of contests of hegemony that I was talking about just a few minutes ago, a lot of the secular parties have adopted the language of Islamic politics. Some local governments run by sort of secular parties actually have come up with local edicts, which we call Sharia bylaws, where things like the behavior of women, how women dress, and so on, is supposed to be regulated. They can't be enforced, but they're there. And what does this show really? Well, what we're saying is that, well, I mean, the Islamic parties may lose, but the ideas and so on, the symbolisms that are associated with them are appropriated by other political forces, therefore resulting in the mainstreaming of the ideas, or some ideas of Islamism, without necessarily the political victory of Islamism, as you might associate with the case of Turkey. So, fieldwork was undertaken there in 2018 and 2019, two periods of fieldwork each. But unfortunately, as I mentioned earlier, we were not able to do any fieldwork in 2020. And if the ARC does provide me with an extension on my discovery grant, we'll have to figure out a new way of conducting our research, because it does actually involve a lot of intensive interviewing, sort of very selected interviews with workers, with community leaders, Islamic preachers, and ordinary people, and it's not something that you would normally be able to do through a survey method. We have a lot of thinking to do about how we would continue to undertake this. Actually, another thing I should probably mention is that I talked about the capitalist transformations and so on that occurred in Indonesia after the 1960s. This is also reflected in the fact that when these areas in Central Java were Communist Party strongholds, they were mainly agricultural. But now they tend to be peri-urban. Statistically, the Indonesian government often calls them rural, but that's not true. If you go to these places, they have roads, they have the sorts of transportation and communication and infrastructure that you would associate with urban and peri-urban areas, and that probably has a lot of bearing, we think, in the sort of communication or conveying of ideas, between rural, semi-rural, and urban areas, which we can talk about later. Whereas in the Kocaeli area, with its further growth as an industrial center, you've had more people coming in from outside of Kocaeli proper, coming in from the Black Sea region of Turkey, from the Anatolian hinterlands, usually coming from backgrounds anyway that are more conservative and Islamist, therefore changing the demographics of the working population in those areas, and that probably has a big impact as well on the sort of transformation of these places from bases of leftist politics to that of Islamic politics. Now, the thing is that we understand all of these transformations that are happening in the ideational as well as the material level as having to do with things that you would associate with capitalist development and closer incorporation into the logic of neoliberal globalization, including perhaps greater prosperity, but also greater inequalities, new forms of dislocations and social marginalizations. So, for example, Indonesia, in the 60s, nobody would have had much of an education. At most, they would have had some primary school education, but now you meet the people, especially young people. They have at least a high school education. They buy into the promises of modernity, which includes changes in consumer behavior, ideas of upward mobility due to greater possession of skills and education. But generally speaking, because they are consigned into what you might call a very huge precariat that encompasses both the informal and the formal sectors of the economy. So basically, people who have pretty good education compared to 20, 30 years ago, have aspirations, have different sorts of consumption habits, but really don't have the sort of social safety nets, job security, promises of upward social mobility, that then develops into sources of grievances that can be mobilized by social and political forces that contest power and resources. And similarly, or in a parallel fashion in Turkey, you might see, I interviewed lots of young workers and so on. A lot of them are very pious. A lot of them are associate themselves with tarekat. Tarekat meaning the sort of religious orders related to tradition of Sufism, which is strong in Turkey, and they have a lot of them have high levels of education and so on. But it seems to me that the period of high growth that the AKP presided over also developed sort of high expectations, high consumption habits, and therefore bringing a lot of these young people into debt traps and causing new forms of grievances as well. Now, in both cases, really, Islam has been a way of trying to make sense of the world that they find themselves in, and this has been largely possible because, as I said before, all of these developments that happen associated with capitalist transformations and so on occurred after the demise of the left in the case of Indonesia, and its weakening in the case of Turkey. So so the language of politics that is available to them really is quite confined in both cases to either Islam or hyper-nationalism. And in both cases, these two can combine. We see in Turkey, for example, I've seen workers who can go back and forth between the MHP, the ultra-nationalist political party there, and also, sort of engage with the tarekats that, directly or indirectly form support bases for the AKP. Now, in Indonesia, so what's happened is that these grievances then become a way of mobilizing sort of large numbers of people, especially during events such as national and local elections, and they can be powerful. And therefore, we see alliances between secular and Islamic parties, where usually Islamic parties are the junior partners, or Islamic forces are the junior partners, therefore never really attaining a foothold on state power, but influencing the way the discourse of politics takes place, infusing it with more ideas of morality, for example, or Islamic ideas of social justice to address the sort of grievances that you have amongst this young precariat that I was talking to you about. In Turkey, I think it's slightly different because a lot of the grievances were mobilized by the AKP in the first place, against the Kemalist order, and the Islamic language of politics was designed to bring together the Anatolian bourgeoisie that had become more prosperous because of neoliberalization in the 1980s. Who were able to sort of fund the Islamist AKP-related charity work and so on, that would bring the sort of lower members of the socio-economic groups, the proletariat, the lumpen proletariat, and so on, within the Islamist project. But the economic downturn over the last couple of years actually has probably undermine this to some extent, so that we now see, for example, that support for the AKP is down, and the sort of anecdotal, and we can't go further than this at the moment, sort of evidence we've got is that a lot of these pious young Muslim workers and so on are more pro-Erdogan than they are pro-AKP, which then brings up the question about the future of the AKP post-Erdogan, or whenever that will occur. So just to maybe wind this down, a few things that we can sort of identify as being the core observations of the study so far. One is that with the rise of Islamic politics, I mean, perhaps it's obvious to say that you don't necessarily get complete Islamization. It's very rare that you get an Islamic state with all the accompaniments of a state based on Sharia. But you also don't necessarily get the radicalization of Islam, because these Islamic forces, by and large, are working within, the parameters of an existing system, which is also to say that you don't get what Olivier Roy, for example, would call the Islamization of radicalism either, because even the discourse on radicalism is contested. I mean, you don't necessarily convey radical ideas against the particular status quo completely on the basis of the lexicon of Islamic politics.